So without further ado, again, hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Psychology of Student Success, How to Increase Engagement, Foster Belonging, and Cultivate Belonging. In this session, faculty and practitioners will learn about the psychological forces that impact student success and empirically proven principles and practices to help foster greater student engagement and better performance in college. A few housekeeping items to go over. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. Please connect with us using the hashtags MCCA webinar, and we will be sending a recording of the webinar to those that registered today. We are so grateful to have with us again Dr. Omid Fatuhi, Director of Learning Innovation with WGU Labs and Research Associate at the Learning Research and Development Center based at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Fatuhi is a research psychologist exploring and researching the processes and scientific mechanisms underlying human motivation and performance with the goal of empowering individuals to achieve their full potential. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo, after which he worked at Stanford University, where he co-founded the College Transition Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institutional collaborations to deliver proven psychological interventions to over 40,000 students, as well as the Stanford Intervention Lab, a collaborative research group committed to sharing and scaling proven insights from psychology to promote better performance and well-being. He has led 45 professional development workshops across the United States to help students, faculty, leaders, athletes, and corporations better understand the psychology of success and equip these groups with the tools they need to perform at their full potential. And now he can add Missouri's community colleges to that. I will now hand it over to him.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and to speak with you, hopefully with you. I do want this to be interactive to the extent possible. My time is your time. I am a psychologist who has basically spent the majority of the past 15 years diving deep into the theory and the research that helps us understand human motivation in various domains, including academics. So feel free to ask questions, prod, and guide the conversation wherever you see fit. I certainly have some content that I can go through, but I'm also happy to deviate to the extent that it's useful for you all. In terms of how we would manage the conversation, please feel free to include your thoughts, comments, questions in the chat box, and I'm giving Kaylin the permission to interrupt me at any time with a question that seems timely. Otherwise, we will also try to allocate some time towards the end of this session for a Q&A and a more interactive dialogue. So without further ado, let me jump in and share my screen. All right, so the topic today is the psychology of student success. Something like that. All right. One of the most common or more common questions that I often get asked and actually ponder about is this question of whether college is worth it. And I think this is a question that's been top of mind for many of us as we've witnessed some of the admission scandals over the past few years. And also surprisingly, the fact that despite the interruptions and disruptions caused by COVID, that enrollment hasn't completely sunk to levels that would cause most, if not all, post-secondary institutions to close down. And I think what that belies and sort of suggests is that there is a value in going to college, which certainly from many dimensions can be hard to rationalize if you're that individual student who's about to make the decision about whether college is worth it or not. As you can imagine, just having finished high school, you have the rest of your life ahead of you. And the decision about whether to continue for another 4 to 6 years in a school where you know you're going to be expected to sit in classes for long lectures, having to submit assignments and prepare for tests and the anxiety that goes along with that, at the cost of what you're also giving up. For the first time you have freedom, you could be backpacking in Europe, you could be starting your own business, you could just be doing some self-exploration. But instead, the question of whether to go to college or not is top of mind. In addition to the price tag that comes with college, often costing many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to endure. So the question might seem now whether college is worth it or not. And although I can't speak to some of the other personal dimensions of foregoing those life affordances in exchange for a college experience, certainly the data is pretty clear that going to college financially is one of the best things that we can do. That those who end up with a 4-year degree on average, and these are really conservative estimates, usually higher estimates are what we see, that individuals make at least twice as much on an hourly basis, and that across lifetime, that the difference in income for those who do complete a 4-year degree versus those who don't is close to $500,000 in lost earned wages. So from the economic perspective, the data is still pretty consistent that getting a college degree is worth it. It also turns out that in addition to the financial benefits of going to college, that some of the core and fundamental aspects of what defines a good life are also predicted by going to college and the kind of experiences that you have during college. In a large 30,000 participant survey from Gallup, where they asked graduates what determines whether they have a good fit, whether they have a good life and satisfaction in their jobs, that was predicted by the kinds of academic and social engagements that they had during college. So going to college and having an engaged experience predicts not only how much money you'll make, but also the ratings that you have on your life satisfaction and how satisfied you are with your job as well. Despite these benefits, there are historical achievement gaps that we have had to contend with in our institutions for decades. Across different age groups and across multiple decades, we have these persistent performance gaps, achievement gaps between certain groups and others. Across the nation, this is a pretty well-represented pattern where some groups consistently and traditionally have underperformed compared to others. And in light of the recent conversations that we've had related to equity and race and identity in class, I think these are important questions to ask ourselves in terms of why these might be the case. While certainly there are those individuals or groups who will propose that there may be these strong, innate, fixed, fundamental differences between individuals or groups that determine performance at these higher levels of competitiveness. Fortunately, my field of social psychology, which I get to reflect on and represent, has always taken a different perspective, specifically that who we are, how we behave, and how we feel is in large part actually determined not just by our internal fixed traits or internal attributes, but also by the interplay between what happens internally and what happens outside within the context that we live and create our lives in sense of self. In fact, I tend to argue that learning is not so much a process of mastering content that we're exposed to and then expected to absorb and repeat on a test, but rather that learning is a social identity process by which we developmentally explore new dimensions of performance and experiment with whether that's something that we can internalize as one of our identities. We try out a math problem, and if it's hard or something that we can do, that determines whether we can identify as someone who can do math, whether I'm a math person or not. That's a phrase you've probably heard. And that's determined by a number of things. So that's a bit of a spoiler alert. But at the core, and at the beginnings of this conversation around trying to explain these group differences, there was this long prevailing explanation that genetics might be the cause. Some early pioneering social psychologists, again, recognized that the context plays a large role in how some of these outcomes play out. I mean, one of the early studies Claude Steele and his collaborators brought in women into the lab and told them that they would be doing a math test. Now, part of a standardized GRE component of the math section, they were told that this would be a relatively difficult test to do. Now, these individuals who were invited to the lab were actually matched on their grades and on their interest in mathematics and sciences in general. So if you were to compare the men and the women who showed up to the lab, on paper, they were identical, which means that given this test, it would also predict that their performance ought to be identical. And yet something surprising typically happens, which this group of researchers wanted to see if they could interrupt. And that surprising thing is that despite the fact that these individuals are matched based on their performance history, that in the context of that test, that somehow these groups who are contending with certain negative stereotypes underperform relative to how you would have predicted. So in order to disrupt that, what these researchers did is they told half the participants that they would be doing a relatively hard part of the math GRE, so business as usual. But the other half, what they did is to say that in this context, on this specific test, although we know that sometimes there are gender differences on performance, this particular test that you're about to do has shown no such difference between men and women. And so both groups, the ones who were given no additional information and the ones that were given that additional bit of information about this test having no gender differences, were asked to complete the test. And in fact, what they found was a complete confirmation of both the achievement gap hypothesis, where individuals, women who, absent any additional information and matched on score compared to the men who completed the math test, performed lower than the men did on this math test. But in the treatment condition where they told the women, guess what, there is no difference on this test, the women did just as well as men did. And so this became the basis for a fundamental question of why this is the case, why certain messages or certain information in the air, in the context, might lead to such differences in performance, given some pre-existing similarities in the group information. And really, it was this kind of work and a series of replications in a number of different domains that gave way to what we now know as stereotype threat, which is this theory that helps us explain what happens when an individual feels anxious that they or they group will be negatively evaluated by others, or that they might be reduced to this negative stereotype that is held in society about their group. And what this group has also been able to demonstrate is that the sheer concern or worry that you or your group might be negatively viewed becomes the cause for why you might actually underperform. As I mentioned, if you are doing a math test or if you're doing a difficult test and you're aware of these negative stereotypes, in the back of your mind, you're having to do two things. One is to focus on the test at hand. And then the other thing you're expected to do is to fight off these negative thoughts that might be looming in the back of your mind. If you start to feel anxious, you start to think, well, why am I feeling this way? Could it be that in fact, my group is not able to do as well? Maybe I shouldn't be thinking about these things. But wait a minute, I've got a test to focus on. So all of this chatter occurs and clogs and burdens the mind, taxes the mind, if you will, which in turn causes the very same negative stereotype that was at the root for this concern. And so what stereotype threat does is it causes underperformance relative to where you ought to be, relative to your full potential, based on a few mechanisms. One is this depletion of cognitive resources, as I mentioned, because of this conversation that's being had. The other is that it raises your level of stress, which is typically not good when you're expected to focus and be calm. And the third is this increased vigilance or distraction that occurs when you're looking around and trying to see cues of whether or not people are looking at you to confirm that negative stereotype. I should mention here that the research resoundingly shows that there is nothing innate or specific to any particular group when it comes to the maladaptive or decrements of stereotype threat effects. And what I mean by that is that there is no individual predisposition that makes them more vulnerable to stereotype threat compared to any other person or any other group. It's the sheer presence of a negative stereotype about you or your group that is the cause of that intensity. I myself occupy multiple identities. Right now I'm a speaker. When I sit down at my computer, I'm a researcher. When I go for a run, I'm a runner. When I go downstairs, I'm a father, a husband. And in any one of these domains, if I worry that I will be negatively viewed by others because of a perception that I'm not as competent, then that worry becomes the cause of me not being able to do the task at hand, which is to focus and do what's needed. An example of this occurs when I go to the grocery store with my kids, 4 or 5-year-old, and they see something in the aisles that they want, and of course they're hungry, which they always are, it seems. And me, after saying no, that they can't have the toy or can't have the treat, they proceed to communicate with me in the only way that they can, which is to fall on the floor, roll around, scream. Now, when this happens, there is something very instantaneous that occurs that even supersedes my own parental instinct to tend to my child's need. And what happens is recognizing that I am a man out in society with my child without the mother, and my child is not behaving in the way that he ought to, that this stereotype that maybe men are not as good a parent as women are comes to mind, is activated. And what it does is it fills me with anxiety, it fills me with uncertainty. And instead of allowing me to get down to my kid's eye level, looking him at the eyes, calm him down, and then be able to proceed, hopefully making that a learning opportunity for how to regulate, instead the anxiety fills me up. I grab my child and I run out of the store because I don't want that negative stereotype to be confirmed. And this is in spite of the fact that I am an expert on this stuff. Knowing about it does not necessarily mean that you can reduce its effect. Another example, which again highlights the fact that these stereotype threat effects are not unique to any individual or any particular group. So if you take men of different race, so let's say Caucasian, African-American men, and you bring them into the lab and you say, you're about to do this physical activity task of swinging a golf club. Depending on how you frame the intention of that activity will determine who will experience the negative stereotype and consequently who will have the underperformance effects that we typically observe. When framed in the following, which is to say that the researchers tell the participants that this is a measure of your innate athletic ability, we actually find that it's the Caucasian people who underperform because they somehow feel that there is this negative stereotype that because of their race, they don't have that innate athletic ability. Now, given the same task, and instead given the framing that this is a measure of your athletic intelligence, causes a different stereotype to come online and causes another group to underperform. And again, this is true for all of us as it relates to any one of our multiple identities where we feel that that particular dimension of ourself could be negatively viewed by others in society. And that causes the kind of burden that prevents us from focusing, prevents us from being okay in that moment, prevents us from being able to learn, and instead wants us to disengage. It wants us to escape because of the aversive feeling that comes from that reaction. Now, one of the premises for being able to convince you that this is indeed a very real and pernicious issue is first having to take a step back and challenge what I think we all know and call reality. From a psychological perspective, reality is not necessarily the subjective thing that we all interact with, but rather it's the subjective experience that is fallible, it's biased, and it's context dependent. To demonstrate, I'd like you all to look at the image here and maybe in the chat, if you could tell me what you see. I won't be scanning the chat, but please go ahead and just type really quickly what you see in this image. Okay, hopefully that was enough time to type in a few responses. Now, typically people will either see one of two things, either a bird or a rabbit. And you might think, okay, well, I tend to see the bird and that's just how it is, or I tend to see the rabbit and that's just how it is. But it turns out that context matters, right? When the same image is presented to participants at different times of the year, this same image will actually solicit a different response from similar groups of individuals. So asked around Easter Sunday, people are more likely to see the rabbit. When asked closer to Thanksgiving, people are more likely to see the duck or the bird. The only time I ever saw this experiment fail is when I was at Oregon and their mascot was a duck. Almost everybody saw the bird and no one saw the rabbit. So again, context playing a role in our perceptions, even of what we think reality is. Now, similarly, if I ask you to look at these symbols, you might think that they're identical. And yet when I allow the context to come into the background, all of a sudden that same character seems different. It now represents something entirely different. Same as below, you might see one of two things, but that difference perception becomes even more clear when the context adds some clarity around what that cue or ambiguity means. One last demonstration, and again, in your chat, with the two circles that you see on the screen, please tell me if you think the left one, which is the blue one, is bigger, or the right one, which is the orange one, is bigger. Which of these two circles is bigger? I'll give you 1 second to type it in the chat. Well, it turns out that these two circles are actually identical. Now, with the mere suggestion that one of these two circles might be different in size, I was able to, even for a moment, get you to question your own senses about what reality is. Now, the reason why I'm going through this exercise is not to show that you are all fallible, which, by the way, we all are to a certain extent, but to demonstrate the power of the context and the role that our minds have in creating a meaning in the context that we find ourselves, especially in contexts that are either novel or contexts that are of importance. We all go through life with our own little personal narrator on our shoulders, telling us what things mean. And the same thing can mean something very different to two different individuals. For instance, if you get a student who gets a D in a math class, now, this student might say, well, I got this D because, I must not have studied for the right sections of the text. I'm going to talk to my teacher so that I can find out how I can better study for the next test. Now, instead, another student who gets that same D makes the following attribution. Now, this is clearly evidence confirming that I'm not smart enough and that I don't belong in college. I'm probably an admissions error and I should drop out because I can't handle it here. That same D, interpreted in different ways, has potentially a different consequence, which I will try to get into. The other component that I think is important to highlight is this phenomenon known as the Stanford duck syndrome. Now, when I was at Stanford, we had this analogy for incoming freshman students as ducks, who, as they enter college, are these students gliding across the surface of the water, and they see each other as these other ducks gliding across the surface. Now, what they see for other students and they see for themselves is actually a very different thing, because when they look around, they see all these other ducks seamlessly gliding across the surface of the water. But what they don't see for the other ducks that they do see for themselves is that they are paddling furiously to stay afloat. And what that does is it creates the perception that somehow you are the only one struggling. And when you look around, everybody else seems like they're just fine. They're just gliding across without any effort. The other thing that's challenging here is that when you fall prey to this perception that you are uniquely different and you are the only one challenging, and nobody else seems to be struggling, what that also does is it prevents you from speaking out about it, which sustains this phenomenon that's known as pluralistic ignorance, this perception that everyone's okay and that I shouldn't speak up about my challenges, which is at the cause of why everyone thinks everyone's okay. So we in turn become an agent of its propagation because of the force that it has and our perceptions of what our world is. when it comes to college, we actually find that there are these core questions that students ask themselves as they navigate through critical touch points. And those questions are, maybe it's me or people like me who are just struggling and nobody else is. Maybe I don't belong. Maybe I'm not smart enough. Or maybe none of this really matters. I think when it comes to these core questions that students ask themselves early in their college experience as things get hard and difficult, it also is important to understand the consequences of the answers that they generate. Because if they do have a confirmatory answer to these questions, that maybe it is just me and maybe I don't belong and maybe I'm not smart enough, that leads to some pretty maladaptive consequences, which includes feelings of shame, wanting to isolate and wanting to disengage. And as I've mentioned, those individuals who are from negatively stereotyped groups are disproportionately at risk of making these negative attributions, because absent any other information, if you get that D in a math class, or if you have an ambiguous interaction with your teacher who in college has to support more students than maybe you're used to with your high school teacher, and it's not as warm as you would have liked, you now have to make meaning of that situation. And absent any other information, given this ambiguity, students will often or sometimes rely on the negative stereotypes because that's all they have to go by. So why is this relevant? Not to seem too doom and gloom here. What I do want to share is actually the fact that the same mechanism that is at the cause for people being able to make varying attributions about the same event is also the cause that allows us to have positive interventions that help to circumvent those negative experiences and those negative attributions. So the good news is that I'm going to be sharing with you some proven strategies of how we can intervene and create cultures that foster some of these adaptive outcomes that we want for our students. And those three groups of interventions that target underperformance fall into three categories. The first has to do with the psychological interventions that target students' individual vulnerabilities, such as the perceptions of the negative stereotypes that may exist or loom large in your mind. The second is not assuming that the core or the sole cause of underperformance has to do with students' subjective lens, which they use to make meaning and understand and see their world, but rather to understand that the contextual cues have an objective messaging impact on these students. So it's not just in the student's head, it's also sometimes what they see around them that determines how they see themselves in this place. And the third is a slightly more hybrid and ambitious goal, which is to change cultures, not only to understand how we can foster more adaptive mindsets in our students, not only to understand how do we create contexts where students can thrive and survive, but also how do we change cultures so that these things are self-sustaining. So I'm going to try to go through each of these. And again, if you have questions about the specifics, feel free to put them in the chat. I've given Kaylin the permission to interrupt if they're relevant and timely, or we can reserve some of these questions for the end as well. So the first one has to do with the psychological interventions that targets student psychology. Now, what I want to sort of first lay out is that these interventions that target specific psychological vulnerabilities are not these plug and play kinds of approaches that you can apply in any context and hope that they'll work for anyone and everyone. In fact, they're quite tailored to the individual and to the context. For instance, there's a group of work that my colleagues and I have been working on and certainly has been pioneered by folks like Jeff Cohen, Greg Walton, Claude Steele, David Yeager, Mary Murphy, Christine Logel, that really tries to target that belonging uncertainty, this fundamental question that students come into college with, asking, do I belong or don't I? And interventions that help to interfere with the negative attributions of those negative experiences. Now, where these interventions are actually been able to show long-term effects is in the mechanisms in which they operate, right? Because most of these interventions are these one-off 45-minute kinds of exercises where students are asked to reflect and think about certain experiences of themselves and their peers. The studies that have demonstrated impacts show long-standing effects 10 years or more sometimes for these one-time interventions. And the question is, why and how does this work? Well, how it works is by changing the lenses that students use to make meaning of those early experiences. So if I am concerned that maybe I don't belong, but I'm exposed to an intervention that helps me to delay that negative attribution, even by a little bit, then that next interaction will actually allow me to engage more deeply and more meaningfully. It will allow me to have the kind of contextual validation that I need to make me feel like, yeah, maybe I do belong. So I'll be more comfortable when I talk to peers. I'll be more likely to go and speak with a professor. And those behaviors in turn help to reinforce a more adaptive attribution about whether we do belong, whether we can do it, and so on and so forth. So these positive attributions lead to positive behaviors, which lead to positive outcomes, and there in turn reinforce the positive attributions. And that's how these negative and positive cycles of recursion occur. If a student similarly has a negative attribution about the meaning of that D in their math class, and they conclude that maybe it is something about them, they're going to be less likely to talk to their professor. Consequently, they'll do more poorly on that next test. And in turn, that initial concern that maybe I'm not smart enough will be solidified and confirmed. And by that point, a lot of damage has been done. So how the social belonging intervention works, which is just one of the examples of these psychological strategies, is they help to do two things. One is to normalize the common anxieties and uncertainties that all students have as they transition to college. And what they do is they steer students away from making attributions that might suggest to them that maybe it's something about them or their group that's fixed and internal, that is at the root cause for why they might be feeling the way that they do. If they don't understand how to navigate a financial application form, or they don't know where to find their office hours, or they get a bad grade, or they're having a hard time studying, again, the question of do I belong comes online, because that's how they try to make meaning of these uncertainties and these difficulties. And what the social belonging interventions do is they help to provide an alternative explanation that perhaps what you're feeling is actually normal, and that when you try something new, that you're going to be a little bit anxious. You're going to not know everything at first, and that this is common. A lot of other students feel it, not just you. And how they demonstrate that normalcy is they get students in the interventions to view responses and quotes from upperclassmen who have shared their perspective on the challenges as they transition to college. And so seeing evidence that they are really not the only ones helps them to delay that negative attribution when they do have that difficulty. The other thing that these interventions do is that they also reframe the permanence of the meaning of those negative events. And one of the worst things that can happen when something bad happens is if we feel like that negative experience will last forever. If you've ever had a heartbreak, then you know that it's not the pain in the moment, it's the concern that this pain will last forever. That really is quite heartbreaking. And the same thing is true for these individuals who are navigating these novel situations, trying to make meaning of, is this something about me that will last forever? And what these interventions do is they dispel both of those components, that it's not you, and these things pass with time. In fact, things get easier with time. So when students are exposed to these interventions, as I mentioned, they're typically depicted in these kinds of quotes, and if you'll indulge, I'll read one of them to you. This is a quote from an upperclassman that students read in these interventions that reads, "When I first got to school name, I worried that I was different from other students. Everyone else seemed so certain that they were right for the school, and yet I wasn't sure if I fit in. Sometimes after my first year, I came to realize that many people come to school uncertain whether they fit in or not. Now it seems ironic. Everybody feels that they are different freshman year from everyone else, when really in at least some ways we're all pretty similar." And even hearing that from somebody else that resonates with what they're feeling in that moment is immensely powerful, because now it feels like you're not the only one, right? If you've ever gone to a party, it's not the most anxiety provoking if you know at least one other person, right? It's most anxiety provoking if you know nobody else. You feel like everyone's watching you and that somehow you shouldn't be there. But if you know that just one other person is there, that you share something in common with one other person, that makes it tolerable, that makes it okay, and that allows you to stay there a little bit longer. And these interventions are obviously delivered in relatively wise, as we call it, informed ways that help to mitigate some of the normal defense mechanisms that we have. One of the things I've learned as a parent is that the best way to get a child not to do something is to tell them what to do and why they should do it. And so we try to avoid these direct kinds of advice approaches to try to convey to students that what they're going through is normal. It doesn't help if you tell them, hey, it's normal and you'll get through it. It's important that they hear it from others, and then they have a chance to actually voice that back out for themselves and for others. And so one of the things that these interventions do is they're framed around this being an activity where we're trying to learn from students like you, who are the experts in the transition to college, having just transitioned to college. And what we hope to do is to take the insights that you have and share them with future generations of students so that they have a better roadmap around how to navigate the challenges that you are going through. And when students are given this framing, they're taken out of that role as a beneficiary and instead placed in the benefactor identity. Now they feel like what they have to share is of value, and they're not just asked to share because somehow they are seen as somehow deficient in some way, that maybe they just can't come to belong, which is an expectation that all students should have. And this is an important component. When you are able to get students to adopt that mentality that they are there to help others, they're much more likely to give you content that's richer, that's more meaningful, but they're also more likely to internalize and accept what they've just now given as advice because they're the one that gave the advice. And there's a lot of psychology behind that as well. Now, these early interventions have actually found some pretty powerful effects, as I've mentioned. On the left, when you look at the stereotyped groups, the white and the Asians typically in this context, that whether they're in the control condition or in the belonging condition, doesn't really make a big impact on how they perform. But for those groups contending with negative stereotypes, what you find is that in the lighter green bars, you have the traditional achievement gap, which is about half as much as those from non-stigmatized groups. But the intervention is able to reduce the achievement gaps by anywhere between 35 and 53%. Because what these interventions do is they delay the negative attributions that causes the disengagement that students experience when they encounter new and challenging situations. And it's also manifest in the kind of social networks that they have. So again, these interventions for those groups show that they actually are engaged and have more connections with their peers, and that they interact with their faculty and student support services a little bit more as well. And these are the causes for why these students actually end up doing better, is not because the intervention somehow makes them smarter. It doesn't work that way. It's because these interventions allow them to engage with the resources that are on campus and designed to support these students. Rather than worry that maybe this is not for them, they actually do engage deeply with these resources. I'm going to skip a little bit, and I'm actually going to skip through the growth mindset intervention series. I think you probably have already heard about it. I offer a whole couple-day long workshop, and I'm happy to revisit this topic if it's relevant to you all. So I encourage you all, if you are interested in diving deep into growth mindset, that you either text us in the not text but chat in the chat box, let us know that this is something you'd be interested in, or reach out to Kaylin and myself and let us know. But for the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and to talk about a different category of programs that we can apply that have less to do with these individual psychological components and more to do with understanding the role of the context. So as I've mentioned, the underperformance effects are not always just a result of the lens through that the students use to make meaning of the world. Sometimes a female engineering student who is going to class in these long hallways where there's picture after picture of old white guy, and they get into class and they're one of 3 female students in a class of 60 students, and they have to, after getting a bad grade, just want to go to the bathroom and get a moment of pause, and they realize that the washrooms for the women were an afterthought for this institution, so they have to now walk through another obscure long alley, have to make meaning of what all these cues suggest about who they are and whether they belong in this context. And although seemingly subtle, these cues consistently convey something to students who, in those moments of uncertainty and anxiety and difficulty, might infer a different meaning. So here, if you'll look at the image that's in front of you, this is an image from a study that was conducted where they invited females to come into the lab, and the lab was supposedly a TA's office that they could go to and ask for some advice. Now, this is a computer science program, by the way. And so as you see on the walls, there's some images and objects that you typically would expect to see in a TA's office: a poster, some sci-fi books, some pop cans. Now, in the other condition, what they did is they rearranged the room. They actually replaced some of those objects, those cues, with more gender neutral cues. So instead of the Star Trek one, they have these nature posters, they have more neutral books, and instead of pop, they have water. Now, at this point, you might be thinking what I first thought when I saw these results, which was, so what? Well, so what actually is that women who enter into these contexts expecting that the prevailing negative stereotypes about their group will be relevant are surprised when they're not. In fact, going into that treatment condition TA's room was able to show a greater persistence or greater retainment of students' interest in computer science compared to those who went to a more traditional classroom. And when it comes to these cues, they're kind of everywhere. I'm not going to fly through what typically a lot of students have to navigate as they're thinking around picking courses for their programs, right? I think this is from a math or computer science major diagram for the courses you need to navigate. And certainly the internet is bound with examples of these complex schematics of what a student is expected to navigate in order to graduate with a degree. Now, if you're having to make sense of all of these difficulties, these ambiguities, again, the question is, what does this mean about me or my group? And if the answer is not clear, then unfortunately what that might mean is that there's something about my group that does not belong here. What the researchers, to demonstrate this, did was they had students, first-gen students and non-first-gen students, complete an online form where they filled out the form, and after hitting continue, the form either completely erased everything or retained the information asking for some clarification. Now, we've all had this experience when we complete a form and everything gets deleted. We get quite frustrated. Now, it's pretty clear that everybody feels that the version of the form that was deleting everything was more frustrating. But what's interesting is that for first-gen students, that actually had a very different meaning about their belonging in college, that those who experienced this bureaucratic hassle and our first-gen students now took this to mean that if I can't even complete this simple form, maybe I don't belong here. And certainly there's some work that can be done in terms of what can be done in the context to delay these kinds of messages that students get. I'll share with you really quickly. I know that we're a little bit close to time, if not already past time, as a demonstration of what we did to target these contextual cues. So while in one of the institutions that we were partnering with, the administration came and said, you know, we typically have a pretty good retention rate, but those who don't end up falling up pretty quickly once they start to fall below expectations. And we asked them, well, what do you do to inform these students that they're starting to lag behind? And as many of us do, they are sent a letter of probation where they're informed that unless they change their grades, that they will be expelled from school. Now, from an administrator's perspective, this makes perfect sense. You want to do your due diligence and inform students of their standing so that they can take the corrective actions necessary. But from a student's perspective, who knows that they're struggling and all of a sudden gets this letter in the mail that brands them as a disciplinary or probationary student, it has a very different meaning. And essentially what we did in collaboration with this group is we first of all assessed the students who had received the probation letter, and to our surprise and to the administration's surprise, after receiving a probation letter, students were not filled with a sense of gratitude, a sense of commitment, and a sense of clarity. In fact, what they expressed were some of the emotions that we know are predictive of disengagement, feeling distressed and ashamed and alone. So we wanted to prevent this from happening. And what we did is we took the existing probation letter, and without taking anything out, we added some key elements that helps to, again, create a perception that those experiences that the students have are normal and they're common and they're temporary. And when we did this, we in fact found that students, after getting the revised letter, had more positive feelings and less negative feelings after the revised letter. And that subsequently, a year later, they were more likely to still be enrolled after having received the psychologically attuned letter compared to those who got the standard letter. So I'm going to pause there. I certainly have a lot more examples, but just for the sake of time, I want to make sure that we are able to let you go on time, but also address any questions you might have. The one thing I'll say with these interventions, especially as it has to do with psychology, is that these interventions are not the cure-all. In fact, what they do is they help to take out the psychological gunk, as my colleague Greg Walton likes to say, allowing the existing mechanisms to operate in the way that they were designed to do, allowing the students to be able to engage with their faculty and their student support services and their peers in the way that they want to, without that psychological gunk playing a negative role. So with that, I'll pause. There's my contact information. I'm happy to continue this conversation. As you can see, this is something I'm quite passionate about. I think about all the time. And I'm always welcoming of working with individuals who are trying to implement some of these strategies on their campuses. So feel free to reach out, or if we have some questions, we can certainly address them now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, if you have any questions, type them in the chat. We did have a comment from Sarah, maybe. Yes, see also BIPOC, students who have only white instructors. This happens at every institution I've ever worked for. Yes. I did have one thing, just kind of personally, you know, about the stereotypes and telling yourself certain things and it makes you underperform. You know, is it just as simple as saying to yourself, you're just telling yourself that, get out of that mindset?
Yeah.
or what do you suggest?
In fact, that's almost, as you can imagine, adding to that noise, right? Like I mentioned in one of the examples that the internal narrative that I hear is a student who's sitting in a class and worries that their peer Julie might hold some of these negative stereotypes about that person's group, and sitting in front of a test, having to focus. They might hear themselves saying, oh, you know, here's a test. I'm not sure how to answer this question. Oh, I wonder if I do poorly, if Julie's going to think negatively of me. But you know what? Don't worry about what Julie has to say. You know, like, just do what you need to do. Besides, Julie doesn't really clean her clothes that much. She has different issues. Meanwhile, you realize you're engaged in this internal narrative, and what you should be doing is focusing on the task at hand. In fact, one of the common questions I get asked is, what is the optimal psychological state of peak performance? And it's not one of deep enthusiasm or deep curiosity or deep focus. It's actually one of just being psychologically okay, where the mental mechanisms and functions are basically at rest so that you are able to absorb and interact and discern the information that you're interacting with. So to your point, if you feel yourself feeling these concerns, now telling yourself not to worry about it in that moment may not actually have the effect that you would want it to. I think what can be helpful is maybe to try to recognize in advance of these situations that you might feel anxious, or that these stereotypes might exist and impact certain groups, and sort of emotionally prepare yourself for those situations. Or maybe talk to people, right? I think one of the things that keeps us in these silos of perceptions is when we feel that what we feel is different than other people. And at the root cause of you feeling anxious and falling into that situation where you have to make meaning of what that anxiety means for you is because you feel a little bit stressed, a little bit uncertain about doing something that's difficult. But if you learn that everybody feels a bit anxious during a test, then that helps you understand that you're not having to make meaning of this because of these negative stereotypes. Maybe what's actually happening is that you just feel stressed out about the test. And certainly I think I get both the comment in the chat and part of this answer, representation is not an insignificant thing, right? I think if we are one of only very few people in a class, there is this pressure and this onus of feeling like we are somehow the token representative. So there's that added weight. And so the reason why I say this is because there's a lot of conversation around the value of being able to invest in more diverse representation on our campuses, in our classes, in the faculty, and in the leadership, because these things do matter. When Obama came into power, there's actually some research showing that that was an uplifting phenomenon and an event for many African-American individuals, as demonstrated by a surge of some of the attainment outcomes in college and these positions of power.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We do have another question. Hold on, let me scroll up to make sure. What kind of issues come up for online courses where students are a little more anonymous to their peers? Are there methods for eliminating stereotypes or inhibitors in an online format?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will actually contend that online is potentially even more invasive, right? I think in the time of Zoom, there's a zooming in potential. As class plays out, the social class plays out, when we're expected to go on video, we can't hide our background, because if we're sort of sitting at a table that's a shared work area, and in the background our family is moving around, all waiting for their turn for that single computer, that in the time of remote learning, there's also a component of intrusion that occurs that could be relevant. Sometimes when we ask our students to keep their cameras on, it's both, I think, positive, because I agree that engagement is useful, but potentially there's a vulnerability or uncertainty around the class signaling that it will arouse. Because back in traditional classes, when you do go to class, you can choose how your class is represented. You can choose to invest, if you have the means, to choose to invest in some clothing that augments or at least controls to a certain extent that representation of class. Now, with the need to have everything on video, that ability is sometimes potentially disrupted. At the same time, I think to your question around these issues with remote learning, it also comes down to the core desire and the core function that we have to keep our students engaged. Because we don't have the mechanisms on campus to convey to students that they do belong, and the challenges that they have and the difficulties that they have are unique onto them. They are essentially left to their own devices, more in isolation. It does potentially also mean that we need to double down on the kind of engagement, the one-on-one kind of connection that students need to be able to feel like they do indeed belong. So as administrators and as faculty, we have to be attuned and aware that not all students will respond to this transition in the same way. Another thing that I'll mention is that the digital divide, in terms of access, even to the basic technologies of bandwidth or the hardware necessary, when they're trying to listen into a class and the bandwidth is not strong enough, that also creates a level of frustration that again creates the opportunity for negative attributions around what does this mean about me and my group. So there's a lot there. There's a lot we're still learning, but I think at the end of the day, if you want to figure out what to do, think about what are the ways that I can promote engagement, recognizing that the students don't have the resources that were available to them in the more traditional context.
Thank you. I work very hard to bring and focus on context to my classes. When I need to test traditionally, I struggle with my own bias. Thanks for explaining why that's happening to me. Thanks, Jenna. And then another question from Sarah. As you mentioned, beyond these psychological lenses, I think of the co-occurrence or triggering of mental illness as a result of these messages students are internalizing. How do we need to be prepared to deal with these deeper psychological consequences within the institution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, it's interesting because I think as institutions, as educational institutions, we are tasked with two things. One is to equip students with the content mastery, which comes in the form of the curriculum. And the other is really to be partners in the student's lifelong growth journey. And that second component, although we're not given the time allocations or the resources or the effective training on how to do that effectively, is just as integral as the first component is. And so as we're thinking around the core basic needs of belonging that every individual has, a disruption to that need is one of the precursors for some of these health issues, both mental and physical health issues. I will just maybe reiterate something that is important from psychology. You know, there are just a small handful of core needs that need to be fulfilled, belonging being one of them. And the reason why I bring up this distinction is that a need is different than a desire. You may desire to get a good grade, you may desire to be engaged, you may desire to get a good job, but if those things are not met, they don't cause a kind of disruption to your basic functioning that prevents you from being able to engage and continue. When there is a disruption to one of those core needs of competence and adequacy and belonging, then it's hard to continue going forward. And so as you're thinking around what are these precursors to these mental health issues, I would submit to you that potentially it's a disruption of these core needs. And so what that means is if you're trying to delay or prevent or minimize the occurrences of these issues, understanding what those core needs are and how we as individual faculty members or administrators can create the experiences that allow students to have those needs filled is one of the best things that we can do.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Keith. How can we engage faculty in this process via the classroom? Specifically, how do we train faculty to provide messages about academic success similar to the edits to the probation letter?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I think, as I mentioned, teachers are placed in a very difficult position because they're sort of expected to not only have the perfect curriculum that optimizes student learning, but also to be these partners for students' emotional and psychological well-being, in addition to creating these cues in the context that really fosters all of that, without much support. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of freedom. I think as you're first and foremost committed to this core goal of supporting your students for their whole selves, then that is the best basis and starting point for you to be able to move forward. And so with that, if you do indeed have that core goal in mind, then experiment with ways in which you can do that. You may not always get it right. At times it may even backfire. But if you understand that at the end of the day, keeping that desire to really support students in their basic needs will allow you to find ways that does resonate with students, even if some of them don't resonate with all students. I think some of the things that we can do, and we do this in terms of training for faculty, in terms of providing the best practices and some of the structures that is needed to maybe try out these early strategies that have been shown to be effective, can be immensely powerful. And I'm happy to share some resources and strategy with you if you want to reach out to me. Again, feel free to email me or Kaylin. But I think at the heart of it, it's having that understanding, that respect, that recognition that students' core needs is front and center, as opposed to relying on just the words or the potentially superficial practices that is supposed to come across as representing these core caring and sense of trust, because unless the two are sort of matched, students pick up on that pretty quickly, and that backfires. But if the authenticity of and the genuineness of your intentions is clear and consistent, I'm pretty sure that you'll do well.
Thank you. And we have another one. What are the core basic needs you're referring to? Are we talking about Maslow?
Yeah, so I think Maslow does have a really good representation. One of and depending on the theoretical framework that you use, you'll have different combinations. But one of the theoretical concepts that I like, frameworks that I like, is self-determination theory. And in there are three core categories of core needs that includes autonomy, competence, and belonging. So I think if those three elements are fulfilled, then a student is thriving towards self-actualization and optimal performance and intrinsically driven motivation. So I think those are the three core needs that I would think is really necessary. Now, I think as we talk about competence, we have a system that allows students to demonstrate competence through their testing. As we talk about belonging, we've already mentioned a few, but autonomy is also an incredibly important one. When we think of our existing educational system, it's in many ways actually designed to kind of suck out all the autonomy that any student could hope to have, because we tell the students what to study, when to test on, how to think, how to learn, and even how to feel, which leaves very little for autonomy. And as you're thinking around, what can I do to reintroduce autonomy? There are about 7 to 12 levers that are available to you that you can pull on to augment the level of autonomy. And again, that's a workshop that I'm happy to share with you all. I have resources I'm happy to share with you all, so feel free to reach out. But these are great questions, and I love that you all are thinking about these things.
I had that come up this last week when I was telling my son, you have to listen to the teacher all the time. This is what she's saying to do. And he said, I did it at work. And I said, well, you have to, I was struggling. I was like, well, actually you should stick up for yourself and advocate for yourself. But at the same time, you kind of do have to listen to the teacher. So I struggle with that. That's an very interesting point that you bring up. And I don't see any more questions popping up right now, but please keep them coming. I will talk about some upcoming events and some things up here, but please, if you have more questions, don't hesitate to type them in, and we will get to them. I do want to thank everyone for joining us. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Fatuhi. We appreciate you so much for shedding some light and sharing your expertise with us. We do have some upcoming events I would like to share. Be sure to register for our webinar next week. It's on November 21st with Roger Wilson from Mineral Area College. A look back and a look forward on LGBTQ rights in education. He is the founder of LGBTQ History Month, which is kind of exciting. We also have a What to Know Before You Go webinar on November 4th, leading up to our annual convention, which will be virtual this year. Convention is November 11th through 13th, and registration has been paid for employees at most of our colleges. You can find out if that applies to you and register at mccaconvention.com. Voting is open for our 2021 advisory board, so be sure to get your vote in today. And we will be sending a recording of today's webinar to everyone that registered via email. And again, you can share your experience today on social media using the hashtag MCCA webinar. I don't think we had any more questions come in. Tammy says, thanks so much. Yes, thank you so much. This is very interesting to me. I could have sat here and talked to you about these topics all day long. So thank you very much. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and have a great day.